In the first two parts of Chapter 1, we examined what is a tax, the basic formula for calculating tax, as well as the jurisdiction and the type of taxes. In this third part of Chapter 1, we're going to examine the sources of federal tax law. In the prior two units of Chapter 1, there's an important theme, and I don't know if you caught on to it. It's the fact that taxation is pervasive, regardless of where we sit, where we do business, or how we do business. Someone's going to find a way to tax us for it. And we're going to cover many of those taxes later on in this text. The other fundamental property of taxation is the fact that taxation is dynamic. If, for whatever reason, a government needs to raise more tax revenue, it can and will do so through identifying a new tax source, by changing the tax rates, which we learned is the percentage of the tax base that's owed in taxes, or by changing the definition of the tax base. The identification of new tax sources is the most controversial way to create new tax revenue because nobody likes new taxes. But these, the tax rates and the tax base, are changed with some regularity. In this slide, we can see a brief history of the tax law. Taxes were first levied on American citizens in 1861 to raise funds to support the Union Army in the Civil War. A later law made taxation in the United States permanent. In 1913, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913, which provided more guidance on the process of taxation and the sources of taxation. In 1986, Congress compiled all tax laws into the Internal Revenue Code. While this is the name of the document, it's a living, breathing document that changes at least annually with new additions, with new deletions, with new rates, and with new tax bases. Relevant to this class personally is the Tax Cut and Job Act of 2017, which made sweeping changes to corporate and individual tax requirements. We'll get into some of these specific changes in Module 2 when we talk about the individual taxation. Within the United States, there are three sources of federal tax law. The first, which has the highest degree of authority, is statutory authority. And this is the tax law that's passed by the United States Congress. As we talked about when we looked at the history of taxation in the United States Congress created the Internal Revenue Code in 1986, and they periodically amend this document. Federal tax law also comes from administrative authority. Those are the documents generated by the Internal Revenue Service, which writes the federal tax regulations that provide an interpretation of the law. These are the second highest authority, but these will always direct back to the Internal Revenue Code and the primary statutory authority. Finally, tax law is created by the United States federal courts, who, when a tax law is called into question, review the facts of the case, and through their interpretation of the law, amend the law effectively through their interpretation. We'll get into these briefly in this chapter, but we'll talk more about the judicial authority when we go into Chapter 18, the enforcement and the questioning portion of our units. As I said, the United States Congress is the ultimate authority in establishing and determining the tax code. The tax code is a law, and just like any other law, it goes through a specific process as specified by our Constitution. For the creation of tax law, a change in the tax code originates in the House Ways and Means Committee. Once the committee agrees on a resolution, the change to the code goes to the full United States House of Representatives for a vote. After the United States House of Representatives has approved the change, it goes to the Senate Finance Committee, who amends the code as they see fit. If they've made major changes to the proposed changes, it goes to a conference committee of both the Senate and the House to agree upon a resolution. From there, it goes to a full vote in both houses and to the President's desk for a signature. The end product of all this deliberation and conferencing and committee meetings is the Internal Revenue Code, which gets amended pretty much annually. The second highest tax authority is federal tax regulation, which is generated by the Internal Revenue Service. This document provides the interpretation, the implementation guidance, and the illustrations of how the Internal Revenue Code is to be implemented. Now, occasionally, the IRS gets called upon to defend their stance on their interpretation. These take two forms. A revenue ruling comes from a tax code stipulation that is called into question. The IRS reviews the tax law as it applies to a particular set of facts and determines what they believe the tax liability should be in that condition. These revenue rulings don't have the weight of law, but they do provide good guidance to what the IRS will do in similar cases. And likewise, the IRS also issues procedures that advise taxpayers how to comply with different IRS procedural and administrative manners. Again, these procedures do not hold the weight of law, but they do hold and help illustrate the IRS's prevailing mindset. These revenue rulings and these revenue procedures are periodically combined and published so that the public can be aware of the IRS's thought process. Finally, judicial authority. Taxpayers can bring their grievances to the U.S. tax courts, and the tax court verdict becomes the precedent for future tax cases. A tax case can be appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, but we'll get into that in Chapter 18 when we look at the IRS's enforcement authority and the grievance process for taxpayers. So in Chapter 1, this first week of class, we examined what is a tax, how we calculate tax, who bears the tax, the jurisdiction to tax, and where the creation of tax authority generates. In the next week, we're going to cover what is the philosophy behind tax policy and how the IRS enforces tax policy. This week, you'll have a reading, a Learn Smart, and a problem assignment, as well as a discussion board assignment, wherein you introduce yourself to the class and what you know about taxation. I look forward to reading your discussion board posts and answering any questions you may have about this first week. Thanks. Carry on.